Okay, my next guest is disgusting. Now, for all of us who have ever dreamed of meeting all of our musical heroes, this guy has actually lived the life that we've all dreamed of. And it's hard not to be jealous. I read his book called A Grandmother's Prayer, Moments in a Music Life. He says his name is Chris Christian, but after reading his story, I think he's the real-life Forrest Gump of the entertainment world, because he's been everywhere, he's worked with everybody, and he knows everybody. Chris Christian, what is up with you, man?
Governor, I'm so honored to be on this show and to meet you virtually, and I hope to meet you in person.
Well, I'm excited about it. I loved the book, read every word of it, couldn't put it down. One of the things I found interesting, your grandmother, everybody called her Monkey, but when it came to praying for you, she did not monkey around. Tell me about that.
She did not monkey around. When I was in the about 5 years old, every time we prayed for dinner, for breakfast, dinner, anything, she would pass the biscuits, but before we eat, let's pray, and let little Chris go into the world and preach the gospel. And so she never prayed that she didn't pray that let little Chris go into the world and preach the gospel. Well, in about the same time, fourth grade, Dal Patterson was my teacher was Mrs. Patterson, and Dal Patterson, her son, had a hit on the radio in Abilene. And I heard him play in our class, and I said, that's what I want to do. So you fast forward, and the reason for the name of the book, Grandmother's Prayer, is I really think the way all the unusual things that happen, like the Forrest Gump moments that you just commented about, I think it was answer to the way God answered prayer.
Well, it's such a great story. Honestly, when I was reading it, the whole time I kept thinking, this guy's Forrest Gump. He showed up at every kind of place that most of us could have only dreamed of. For example, you get on an airplane headed to Hawaii and just happened to be seated by, who were you seated by?
George Harrison, the Beatle. I know.
What's the likelihood of that?
And we talked, what's the likelihood of never meeting Elvis, never playing him a song, and writing a song in high school that he decides to record? What's that? What are the likelihoods? What's the likelihood of signing a 16-year-old girl at church and selling 30 million plus records? I mean, these things just shouldn't happen. And I'm the first one I just feel like I lived my life underneath the umbrella of my grandmother's prayer.
It was an incredible story. You mentioned Amy Grant. The surprise to me in that story was that you knew her from church. She was not some overly ambitious kid that was just dying to be in the recording industry. You kind of had to talk her into it. And yet, I'd say it turned out pretty well.
It did turn out well. Probably had to talk her dad into it more than Amy because she was not looking for a record deal, but they grew up in Nashville. So I think her dad thinking probably in music business was getting on a bus and playing honky-tonks and concerts, and that probably was not an appealing thing for her father. But my wife grew up with the Grants, and Mimi Grant, her older sister, was one of my wife's best friends in our wedding. So I think I got a little approval because of that, and it turned out to not be the typical music on a bus.
You mentioned Elvis, and to me, one of the great stories, you wrote a song when you're 16. It sits really on the shelf for years, and one day Elvis decides to record it. You end up being befriended by Elvis, but I was struck by his interest in you and a friendship with you was not so much music, but it was a spiritual connection. That was fascinating. Tell us about that.
Rick Stanley was Elvis's half-brother. And after I met Elvis, when I met Elvis, I was working with Wayne Newton at the Sands. And when he came to the opening night at the Hilton, Wayne had Red West, his bodyguard, invite me up to the show and then up to meet him at the top of the Hilton. He'd already recorded my song, but I'd never met him. And then he stood up and had everybody listen to the song, clapped his hands, and put his arm around me. And when Elvis leaned over to me, he said, "What did you think about what I did with your song?" And I've had hundreds of songs recorded. Nobody's asked me, "What did you think about what I did with your song?" except one person, and that's Elvis Presley. To answer your question directly, Rick Stanley was his half-brother, and I kept getting invited after that night at the Hilton where I met Elvis. He kept inviting me to the Memphian and to the malls and to the recording studio. And I said, "Why?" I was 22 3 years old. Why does Elvis keep inviting me from time to time? He says, because Elvis doesn't want to talk about movies. He wanted to talk about God.
I have to tell you, Chris, your book is one of the most amazing books I have read in a long time. Without a doubt, one of the most intriguing and gripping books of a story that has one of two possibilities. Either you're the luckiest guy that ever breathed air, or God really has had his hand on you and your life. I happen to believe it's that God had his hand on you, and it started with the grandmother's prayer. It's a wonderful book that I hope people will get. What an honor to have you on the show, and I'm going to have Keith Bilbrey tell our viewers how they can get Chris Christian's inspiring memoir that is just an incredible faith journey into the heart of the entertainment world. Keith?
Well, Governor, it's on Amazon and other major booksellers, and viewers can learn more and order the book at a special discount price. Plus, get a free ebook version, all at grandmothersprayer.com. And to find Chris Christian's music online, visit chrischristianmusic.com.